Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me here today. A big thank you to Adobe for having me give this presentation, as well as Eidos Montreal for always supporting me. For those who don't know me, my name is Genci Buxheli, and I'm the lead character artist at Eidos Montreal on Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. I started my career in 3D at a very young age, first by working on different TV commercials in 3D, as well as a short animated movie, a few music videos, and in general, the VFX for smaller films. However, I always wanted to become a character artist for video games, so since it was very difficult from the country that I come from to find a full-time position, I started working as a freelancer for different smaller studios making games for mobile, as well as some smaller console titles. In 2017, I moved from Albania to Canada to join Eidos Montreal on this new adventure. While working there, the studio really quickly took a note of my dedication into always trying to improve the quality of the assets that I was making, as well as trying to figure out new workflows and techniques to speed up the process of modeling and texturing. And this is how I was quickly promoted from senior to lead the following year. This is also around the same time where I got first introduced to Substance 3D Designer, and it completely revolutionized the way that I work with 3D and I create my models. As you all know, Substance 3D Designer in the video game industry is primarily used to create new materials and textures, and which was also kind of the case in Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, because we use a lot of designer to create basically all the different fabric patterns, wood, plastic, every material that we could possibly need. And we use the shaders to tile these materials all over our characters to basically enhance the quality, the visual quality. Since I really liked working with Substance Designer, so I started using it also for the actual organic detailing. In this case, all of the different scale textures were done in Designer for some of our creatures, our big creatures, as well as the skin pores for the faces of the human characters. And since I was having a lot of fun while working on Cosmo, the dog, I decided to use Designer to basically detail the nose. One special case of Designer improving our workflow is basically Groot, where Designer in the end was essential into texturing this character, because I wanted to take a different approach from the traditional way of texturing characters. And I took a bit of inspiration from how the level art department textures their own assets. So basically I created different materials and I tiled them in the engine. And I didn't have to actually texture a lot of Groot manually. So what I mean by that is I created the driftwood in Designer, and then a bark layer, and then a moss layer. And then I used the shader in the engine to specify where I wanted the bark to be visible and where I wanted moss. The reason for this is that I wanted this character to be very highly detailed. Whenever you would get close to him in cinematic or even in gameplay, I wanted it to look really, really high resolution. So for this reason, in ZBrush, I only model the main shapes, and all of the secondary and tertiary shapes are coming directly from the textures that I created in Designer. However, while working with the different characters of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, we are often faced with really, really challenging and complex designs, such as this concept that you can see here from the Dweller in Darkness. As you can see, it has a lot of repeating elements that are organic and parametric at the same time. So when I first saw this model, I thought with myself, where do I even start to create this thing? Traditionally, I would sculpt all of these elements in ZBrush one by one. So I would start with the general shape of the head, and then I will go in and create all of these elements one by one. And of course, it's going to take a lot of time in ZBrush to do so. But we also know that we are in a video game production, and designs tend to change and adapt throughout the production. So I was really scared that at some point I would get a request to basically modify the look of this character. And since we don't have a lot of time to do that, I needed to find a new technique that was more time efficient into how do I actually sculpt this model. So for that exact reason, I decided to include Substance 3D Designer and its non-destructive and parametric workflows into my own modeling techniques. So to do so, I used two different techniques that I'm going to show later in this presentation that allowed me to focus more on the main shapes and not on the details. What I mean by that is that I decided to create all of those elements in Substance Designer and then bring them into ZBrush very quickly and try them on my model to see how they react and how they look in general. And then I could always go back into Substance Designer and add more details to the same elements and then quickly update them on my ZBrush sculpt. This by itself, it's a very iterative process because it takes only a couple of minutes to do this exchange between the two software. And at the same time, I could also completely redesign these elements in Designer and then have them back into ZBrush by basically reducing the whole production time from weeks to sculpt something like this to merely days. And this was great for me personally. There was also some special cases where I could use Substance Designer and, for example, a 3D software like Maya to fully create a model, a character in it. So like an example, if you see here, I have the voxyplot, which was basically created fully in Substance Designer. And then I just did the low poly in Maya. This basically allowed me to skip the whole sculpting process altogether. So starting off with the first technique, which is a projection-based modeling technique, I'm going to show a little bit of the progress on how I modeled the actual Dweller in Darkness from the game. I'm going to start first by showcasing how I did the proxy mesh, which would basically be around the area that I want to detail in Substance 3D Designer. And then I'm going to show a little bit of an overview of the designer graph on how I built all of those elements. And then we are going to do the whole transferring of these details back into ZBrush, try it on the model, see how it works. And then I'm going to go back into Designer and do some more changes into the shapes and bring it back into ZBrush very quickly. So without further ado, I'm going to start the video. Okay, so here it is, the Dweller's head loaded into ZBrush. I'm going to export the mesh first as an FBX, and then I'm going to import it back into Maya so that I can turn it into a live surface and I can start doing some retopology on top. I'm going to use Quad Draw to start putting some polygons, and I'm not really trying to get a super clean flow for the edge loops because this is just a proxy mesh anyway, so there is no point in spending time trying to get the flow perfect. So I'm adding polygons only on the area of interest. I don't need to do this for the whole mesh, only the part that I'm going to detail in Designer. And once the mesh is done, I'm going to start working on the UV. So in this case, I unwrapped only one side of it, and then I flipped the other one so that they are overlapping. Now let's export this mesh and bring it into Substance Designer. So here's the graph that I built when I modeled the Dweller. In this case, I started with two gradients and one curve, and then a directional warp where basically it deforms one of the gradients vertically by the curve. So we get the profile of one of the fins, and then I need to add some volume to it. So basically I will use a bevel, I will use blurs, everything that basically allows me to give it some volume. And then in the end I will feed it into a tile sampler so that I can repeat it vertically and add some random rotation and maybe even a little bit of scaling. And then I continued working on the other elements like the discs of the spine that are part of the design, as well as the actual bones that make up the spine. For these ones I use a lot of gradients and transforming just to get the overall shape that I needed. And then again I fed it into a tile sampler. And then I start combining all of the elements into one. Like so. And then I need to add some more details in the parts of the skin that are around it. So basically what's gonna fade into the actual dweller's head. So I'm trying to make the skin sink a little bit where the fins are coming out, as well as add some sort of wrinkles into it. And I also changed the overall volume a little bit and try to fade the right side into neutral gray so that it won't add volume to the model when I import it into ZBrush. Also, it's a good idea to view the output as the base color in the viewport. So whenever I'm working, I tend to see how it's going to react with the actual mesh. Now that I'm done with this, I'm going to export the texture as a TIFF. But first I need to make sure that in the export dialog, the exported color space is set to raw. This is very important because it might affect the actual quality of the height map. So back into ZBrush, I'm going to add some subdivision levels to this proxy mesh. And then I'm going to go into displacement. I'm going to import the texture that we exported. And just previewing it, we can already see the volume. However, it's flipped vertically. So what I need to do to fix this is clone the displacement, go into alpha and flip vertically. And then just reselect it back in the displacement map channel. And there you have it. So right now it's not actually applied to the model, it's just a visualizer. To do so, I'm gonna make a new layer. First you need to go to the highest subdivision, make a new layer, and then apply the displacement. So all of the volume that we added in Substance Designer, it's actually applied to the polygons right now. Now what we need to do next is project all of these details onto the actual dweller's head. And to do so, I'm going to go into the dweller's subtool, and then I'm going to create a layer because I want to be able to change the intensity of the effect or even delete it altogether. So now I'm going to go down into subdivision level 2, and this is because I want to mask out only the area where my proxy mesh is. This is because I want to project only in that specific part. So now I'm going to go into subtool, go to the higher subdivision level, and then back into subtool. We need to turn on the other tool as well because both of them have to be visible. And then I will go into projection, project all. Now it's possible that there are going to be some artifacts specifically in the parts that is overlapping with each other. That is easily fixable by turning off the layer, storing a morph target, turning it back on, and then using the morph brush into those areas to remove all of the artifacts. So now that the projection is done, we have all of the details applied to the mesh, and we didn't have to sculpt any of them. Also, since they are in a layer, we can always turn them on and off or lower the intensity or even delete them. So let's say that you get an updated concept art where the top part of the head looks completely different. In this case, what I need to do is go back into Substance Designer and then I'm gonna go into the curve node. And for this example, I'm just gonna change the profile of the fins into something completely different. So kind of like an inverted effect in this case. I'm just gonna go ahead and re-export the texture again. And then go back into ZBrush. I'm gonna go in my base mesh and I'm gonna delete the layer. So I'm gonna make a new one. And then in the displacement tab, I'm just gonna go ahead and re-import the texture again. So the new texture is gonna be flipped. And we have to do the same trick as before, basically cloning the displacement, going into alpha, flipping vertical, and then reselecting it. Now I'm gonna apply the displacement. And then I will go back into the dweller's head. I'll delete the layer that I previously had and make a new one. And I have to do the selection again in this case. Like so. I'm gonna remove part of the middle point so that it doesn't get projected, just to save time on not having to clean it up after. So going back into the higher subdivision, make sure to turn on the visibility of the proxy mesh as well, and then project. As you can see, it only took a couple of minutes to change the look completely without resculpting anything. And at this point, we can always go back into Substance Designer and add more details if we want to the height map. So for example, smaller cuts or some more skin details to make it even more believable. And then all we need to do is re-import the texture and apply it. Also, since we are now in ZBrush and we are happy with the overall look of the new design, what we can do is we can continue sculpting as usual. For example, making the pattern fade better with the rest of the skin, and as well as maybe adding a little bit more volume in some areas to break the uniformity by selecting it, for example, and then using the move brush to add a bit more interest into these areas. This is basically how I sculpted most of the dweller. I use this technique not only on the head but also on the body, except for the tentacles, because for those I used another technique which I'm gonna show in the next video. So the second technique is a UV-based modeling technique. This basically works great when you have a base mesh with UVs and that you want to keep them, and then you have a repeating pattern all over the mesh. This is how I modeled this tentacle, which was actually used in the game. And since I didn't have enough time to spend too much time on this model, it only took me a couple of hours from start to finish to have it in the game, thanks to this to Substance 3D Designer and ZBrush. I'm going to show another video where I will showcase a little bit how I modeled this mesh. So I will start first in Maya by creating just the base mesh. I'm going to bring it into ZBrush, And then I'm going to apply the height map that I generated in Substance 3D Designer, as well as the base color that I made in the same way. And then since I'm not going to apply these details until later on, I can change the shape and define the look of this tentacle with the displacement on without having to sculpt anything. And then I'm going to apply the height map in the end to get the final model. So to model the tentacle, I started with a cylinder and I added a lot of subdivisions. Then I'm going to tweak the shape a little bit, adding a point. This should work as a base mesh, basically, because I'm going to tweak it in ZBrush anyway. Then I'm going to adjust the UV to make sure that it matches what I did in Substance Designer. I want the tip of the tentacle to blend in perfectly with the rest of it, so I'm going to adjust the UV for this part. With the base mesh done, what I need to do is export it and re-import back into ZBrush. I usually use FBX. Now I'm going to use the transpose tools to shape the tentacle. I want to make sure that the UV was imported correctly, so what I'm going to do is go to Texture and then click New from UV Check. So the UV seems to be working fine. Then I'm going to go into the displacement map and I'm going to import the height map that I exported from Substance Designer. Here I can adjust the intensity to see how it's reacting. Usually this value needs to be way smaller when applied. Then in the texture map, I'm going to import the base color. And I can already see the final look of it without any sculpting. Since we don't have subdivision levels, I can use modifiers like, for example, the bend curve to shape the tentacle the way I want. Here I can use the reference points of the bend curve to give directionality to the tentacle or even twist part of it. And since the displacement is visible, I can see how it's going to react in the end when I apply it. This technique allows for full freedom and control over the mesh because we are not sculpting anything yet. And that means that we can go ahead and change things however we want. For example, I could go back to Substance Designer and change the way that the tentacle looks just by updating the textures and then re-importing them back into ZBrush. Now that I'm happy with the overall shape and flow of the tentacle, I'm going to add some subdivision levels, and then I'm going to create a new layer, go to displacement and apply it. And since we applied it on a layer, we can always go back to the layers and change the intensity or even remove it. However, I noticed that the resolution is not quite there. So to fix that, what I can do is just delete this layer and then add another subdivision level, create a new layer, and then apply the displacement again. This is another advantage of this technique because depending on the resolution of the texture that we export from Substance Designer, we can have even more details into ZBrush. Now what I can do is create a new layer and start sculpting the tentacle. I can add some extra folds, maybe use some of the other brushes in ZBrush, like for example the cloth brush is actually very useful to get some nice compression folds, for example. This process is entirely optional. What I can do is, for example, go back into Substance Designer, make a new displacement map with more folds, bring it into a new layer in ZBrush, store a morph target, and then morph only on specific regions of the mesh. This way, it will help to break the uniformity of the tileable texture. So if I sculpted this tentacle the traditional way, it would have probably taken me a day or two to get it to this level. So that's how easy it was to create the tentacle. I started from a very basic base mesh, I added some subdivision levels, made a new layer, and then applied the displacement map. After that, I added some additional sculpting on top, and that was it. It only took a couple of minutes. So, like I mentioned before, there are some special cases where I could completely skip the sculpting process, which is the case of the Voxy plot. And in this case, I only use Substance Designer and Maya to finalize this model. In the next video, I'm just quickly going to show how I use the exported textures from Designer to build a low poly mesh on top of it, and then in the end, just apply the texture and use it in the engine as is. For this exact model, I really had only a day to finalize it, start to finish. And if I didn't do it through these techniques and through Substance Redesigner, I probably would have not made it in time for the deadline. So let's take a look at it. So the first thing I did was import the normal map that I exported from Substance Designer, and I loaded it into a blin in the normal channel, and I made sure that the color space is set to raw. Then I made a simple cube where each of its faces is using the full UV space and they are all overlapping. Then I selected one of the sides and deleted the rest of them. I'm going to turn this into a live surface. And then I'm going to start retopologizing by using the texture as a guide. So at this point I want to go on top of each of the spikes so they have a clean topology, because in the end this is going to be my in-game model. And also I'm just going to retopo a quarter of it because I'm going to mirror the rest of it. Here it's important to have a bit more polygons, since I'm going to turn this into a sphere, so I want a smooth deformation. For the eye socket, I need to make sure that it's perfectly round, so I'm gonna add some triangles here, but like I said, this is an in-game model, so it doesn't matter if they are triangles. So I'm always using the texture as a reference when putting the edge loops around the eye socket, because I want to be able to adjust its shape after. Now what I'm going to do is make sure that the middle section is all straight, as well as the lower part and the other sides. I'm using snap vertex to make sure that it's exactly in the middle of the face of the cube. And then I'm gonna center the pivot and yet again snap it into the center. This is because I'm gonna mirror the other sides. I'm gonna delete history and mirror vertically. Make sure that the axis position is set to object. And now for the UV, all I have to do is go into the UV editor and create a planar UV. I need to make sure that it fills the whole UV space. Like so. And now I'm going to apply the same material as before. And I need to check if everything is in place. So now I need to duplicate this mesh and fill in the other sides of a cube. Once that is done, I'm gonna merge everything into one object. And then I'm gonna delete history. And now I need to merge all of them. So now I need to merge the vertices. So I'm going to merge and make sure that the threshold is set to 0.01. And I always turn it into a turbo smooth mesh to see if all of the edges are merged properly. So now what I'm going to do is select the mesh that I use as a reference, and I'm going to make two copies of it. One I'm going to turn into a sphere, subdivided 3 times. And the other one I'm going to leave it as a box, but still subdivided 3 times. The reason for this is because I want to be able to blend shape between the two models. So I'm going to move the sphere on one side so we can see. And then I'm going to select the box. And then go to Deform, Blend Shape. Now that it's working correctly, I'm going to select the model that we retopologized, as well as the model with a blend shape. And I'm going to go into Deform, Warp. So now when I turn on the blend shape, both models will turn into a sphere. So I can go ahead and delete history and delete the other mesh. Now that we have the main shape of the character, what we need to do is select all of the spikes and make them protrude. It's easier to select them in the UV space. So I'm going to press Ctrl and the middle mouse button to make them protrude. Now what I can do is grow the selection and do the same thing. What's left to do is select the middle part, so where the eye socket is, and make sure that it also protrudes a little bit. Now that my model is done, what I'm going to do is apply the base color just to check how it looks. And what I can do at this point, if I want, I can go back into Substance Designer and add more details to the skin. So here we have it, a creature modeled using only Substance Designer and Maya. And now it's ready to be used in the game. This whole process only took a couple of minutes from start to finish. So in conclusion, using Substance Redesigner to sculpt these complex characters allowed me to, in a way, simplify the whole modeling process of these complex creatures by deconstructing the actual part that were very difficult to do by hand one by one, and use designers non-destructive and parametric workflows to do so. As well as sometimes it even allowed me to be able to iterate between the different shapes. And in some very special cases, like the one that I showed previously, I could also model characters using only Substance 3D Designer and Maya, which we know in video game production, it's saving time on producing assets. It's quite important and helpful. So thank you so much for being here and seeing my presentation. I hope that you find these techniques at least useful. And of course, there's a lot of ways that you can use these as a base to start and make new, more improved techniques to actually help you create models even faster. You can always reach out to me by email or LinkedIn on ArtStation. And if there is any question, I would be very happy to answer to them. Thank you.
Really great. Okay, mic's on. Thank you, Genci. That was awesome. So now we'll jump into the Q&A. So if you have a question, just raise your hand, and someone from the GDC team will come by and bring a mic to you. Is there any questions? I couldn't see the crowd because of the lights at all. There we go. I think so. There we go.
Hey, how are you?
Hey.
I'm sorry, this is my first time talking on a mic here, so I'm kind of nervous. So I'm just trying to figure out, like, where in the world, you have to be sitting there in Substance Designer, and then you're like, yeah, I'm going to figure out how to make characters out of this, because that's why I was like, here. I was like, there's no way. I remember I used to make jokes about it and stuff. Where were you, and how did that happen?
That's an awesome question. Oh, sorry, Genci. They asked me. I have to repeat the question. Yeah, I would think the same thing. That's super awesome. So Genci's asking, like, how in the world did you come up with this technique?
So while working with the different materials that I was creating, I really saw the potential in the non-destructive workflow, and it really inspired me to say, when I have these elements that are repeating, why would I do it manually by hand while I can automate this whole process in Substance Redesigner? So that's where I started to connect the two, and I thought, yeah, if I can save time sculpting these things in Designer, I'm going to do it, because there's so many other models and assets to create that you really need to, find whatever time you can to save with different techniques. So that's how I did it.
Great, thank you. I think there's another question on this side.
Hello. I've been talking to you guys like all day. So thanks for putting up with me.
No, that's awesome.
So I'm a technical artist, and I always want to figure out a way to push it further. Can you think of ways that the workflow might change, like, for instance, with the Tentacle, when something needs to be skinned and rigged?
Oh, okay, awesome. So the question was, is there ways that workflows could change with the Tentacle when you have to rig and skin the asset?
Like by using Substance 3D Designer, I'm not sure. I haven't really pushed it more than that, because for me, what I did for that Tentacle was enough to get it in the game. But I guess that if you put in the mix Houdini and other software, yeah, why not? I mean, there's one thing that I've noticed with Designer is that there are no limits to what you can actually do, and I find that I'm using it more and more for very diverse things when it comes to characters, basically. For example, like generating the different masks for the shaders, or I don't know, even deciding, for example, which part needs to be reduced in polygons. Like you can mask different regions and then have an auto reducing polygon technique to make it in-game ready. So you could probably use Houdini with that and connect it with Substance 3D Designer.
Cool. Thank you.
Hello, I do have a question. What would be the best practices that you took to learn Substance 3D Designer? And like, how was your journey to like master it to your level?
So I remember the first thing that I did with Substance 3D Designer was trying to get an iris generator for characters. That was like my first task with Designer from the studio. That really, I started very small, like just trying to get the basic how. I needed first to understand how a height map worked, and I think that's a very important thing to know when you start material with Substance 3D Designer, because in this case, I'm using the height map to sculpt the details. So just by getting the idea of how to sculpt, how to make a good height map, I think that's the first step that you need to start with. So start simple, but make sure that you understand what you're doing.
Great.
I just want to ask, like, were you worried about the assets looking a little bit generic just from the nature of making in Designer? And if so, like, how did you overcome that design and technical wise?
Yes, I worried about that a lot, but since I was using layers throughout the modeling part, so I would do, for example, one region of the model applied from Designer into ZBrush, and then I would blend it with another region that was using a different displacement from Designer, So in this way, I could break the uniformity a little bit. Plus, on top of that, I did a lot of manual sculpting for the dweller, for example. On top of these details that I already projected from Designer, I did a pass of manual sculpting to continue breaking the look of it. But the most important thing for me was to get the actual main shapes first in ZBrush and see how it works. And when the whole, let's say when the whole look of the character was approved, then I could continue adding more details manually in ZBrush.
Is there any other questions?
As someone who's very intimidated by making height maps by hand, do you have any strategies for, in the process of making it, like testing out how it looks and whether it works with the sculpt that you want?
Yes, absolutely. So in my case, what I would do is I would make like a default gray value for the height map, and then just add like a very small shape, like for example, just a sphere or something just to get a little bit of height map information and bring it into ZBrush. When I see that the base value is not changing the volume of my model, that means that that value is correct and that it's good. So from there you can go higher or lower with your height map and add more details in that way. It's scary in the beginning. It was for me as well, just to get used to working like this. But once you get used to the idea of what's the base value that does not affect the model and how to add and remove from that, then it becomes way easier.
Hello, thank you for your talk today. I wanted to know, how much trial and error did you end up having to go through when learning or exploring this process?
I think that the trial and error, I did it when I was working on the materials more than the actual modeling part, because by the time that I could make the materials that I wanted with a height map that was correct and that it looked fine, from that point, working only on the height map and apply it into ZBrush, there was not a lot of trial and error. I guess the only part is what I showed in the video, where things tend to go on top of each other, and then when you use projection in ZBrush, you get all of these errors. But there are many ways to fix that easily, which I didn't actually show in the video. But someone who is comfortable with ZBrush knows how to circumvent those errors basically and not have them at all.
Is any other questions? Just checking, Genci.
Hi, this might not be necessarily super related, but I'm more just curious with your workflow. You were talking like about the materials, and in the videos, the textures, materials were already pre-made. What is your workflow process on making those materials prior to making the height map and bringing those into ZBrush?
I always work on the height map first. I find it that it's it's the correct way to create materials as well as to sculpt models. So I always worked on the height map first, and then I created the base color and the rest of the maps basically right after the height map, and utilizing a lot of the information that I get from the height map to create those textures. And in the videos, the point of the video is to actually show how I'm using these maps in the modeling part and sculpting part of ZBrush. And I didn't want to include a lot of how I created the base color, because I find that people who already use Designer, they already have an idea of how that process is done. So that's why I skipped it in this case.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Do we have any other questions? Is it? Okay. Is that it, Tao? Yeah, okay. All right, Genci, I think that's it for the questions. Thank you so much for your session, man. That was really, really interesting, very cool. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.